The auction platform stood in the center of the Valtherian slave market, where beings from 100 conquered worlds waited in chains for their fates to be decided, and the air smelled of fear and desperation mixed with the exotic perfumes worn by the wealthy buyers who strolled between the cages examining their potential purchases. Like one might examine livestock at a farm, Marcus Chen stood with his wrists bound in energy shackles that hummed with a low frequency designed to prevent any sudden movements, and his body appeared lean but unremarkable to the aliens, who passed by his cage making dismissive gestures and commenting on how fragile humans looked compared to other species they had enslaved over the centuries. The Valtherian Empire had been capturing human vessels for nearly 3 decades now, ever since their scout ships first encountered the outer colonies and decided that humanity was too primitive to resist and too useful to ignore as a labor source, and thousands of humans now toiled in their mines, factories, and entertainment arenas across dozens of worlds. Marcus watched everything with eyes that seemed dull and defeated, but behind that carefully constructed mask his mind worked constantly, cataloging guard rotations, weapon placements, exit routes, and the behavioral patterns of every Valtherian overseer who walked past his position, and he had been doing this every day since his capture 6 months ago, during a raid on the colony transport ship, where he served as security chief. The massive doors at the far end of the market hall opened with a hiss of pneumatic systems, and a procession entered that made even the jaded slave merchants straighten their postures and adopt more respectful demeanors. Because Lady Zephora had arrived, and when Lady Zephora came to the markets, it meant someone was about to suffer for her entertainment. She stood nearly 8 feet tall, with skin the color of deep violet and forearms that moved with practiced grace. As she gestured to her attendants and servants who scurried around her carrying packages and recording devices, and her eyes gleamed with cruel intelligence as she surveyed the merchandise available. The day her entourage included several other nobles who laughed at her jokes and agreed with her assessments, and trailing behind them came a massive figure that made even the largest slaves press themselves against the backs of their cages in instinctive fear, because Krell, the unbroken, walked in her shadow. Krell stood 9 feet tall with cybernetic enhancements covering half his body, and his arms ended in hands that could crush steel, and his face bore the scars of 1,000 fights, none of which he had lost, and he was Lady Zephora's champion, the star of her private arena, where she entertained guests with brutal combat exhibitions. The group moved through the market with Zephora pausing occasionally to examine a particularly exotic specimen, but dismissing most with a wave of her upper right hand, because she had seen it all before and nothing impressed her anymore, until her eyes fell upon Marcus standing quietly in his cage. She approached with her friends following, and her first reaction was to laugh, a sound like crystal bells mixed with mockery that echoed through the suddenly quiet section of the market, and she spoke in the common trading language that her translator rendered into words. Marcus could understand. "What pathetic creature is this?" she asked the merchant, who hurried forward, bowing so low his face nearly touched the floor, and eager to please such an important customer. "A human, my lady," the merchant replied with obvious nervousness, because he knew his merchandise was not impressive by Valtherian standards. But he needed to make sales to serve a Vexifera, circled the cage, studying Marcus from every angle, while her companions made jokes about human weakness and fragility, and she reached through the bars with one hand poking Marcus in the chest, as if testing the firmness of fruit at a market stall. "They are so small," she said with amusement, "barely any muscle mass at all, and I've heard they break easily, that their bones are hollow like birds." "Not hollow, my lady," the merchant corrected carefully. "But yes, they are more fragile than most warrior species." Marcus remained still and silent, meeting her eyes for just a moment before lowering his gaze in what appeared to be submission. But in that brief moment, he had catalogued everything about her, from the ceremonial blade she wore on her left hip to the slight tremor in her lower hands that suggested she was not as physically powerful as she pretended to be. "How much?" Zephora asked suddenly, and her companions laughed because they thought she was joking about purchasing such worthless merchandise. "My lady, surely you do not want this one," protested a male noble with golden skin and 3 eyes. "He is not even suitable for labor work, let alone anything else." That is precisely why I want him, Zephora replied with a grin that showed too many teeth. I am hosting games next week, and my guests expect entertainment, and what could be more entertaining than watching Krell destroy something this pathetic in seconds? The nobles around her erupted in laughter at the joke, because it was funny to them, the idea of this small weak human facing the undefeated champion and dying quickly for their amusement, and the merchant named his price, expecting negotiation, but Zephora paid it immediately. With a wave of her hand transferring credits without hesitation, Marcus was removed from his cage and placed in restraints that connected to a hover platform, and as the merchant transferred ownership documents, Zephora leaned close to Marcus, speaking. In a voice meant only for him, "You are a slave now human," she said with satisfaction, "absolute and complete, and in 3 days. You will die in my arena for the amusement of my guests, and your death will at least have some purpose, even if your life—" Did not. Marcus said nothing, but his jaw tightened slightly, and Zephora noticed and laughed again before turning away to complete her other purchases. Because she wanted a few more slaves to throw at Krell before the main event with the human. Transport back to her estate took an hour, during which Marcus sat in silence with 5 other newly purchased slaves who whispered among themselves about their fates and rumors of Lady Zyphra's cruelty, and how no slave who entered her arena ever left alive. Through the window of the transport vessel, Marcus watched the city pass below with its towering spires and floating platforms and ships moving through designated traffic lanes, and he memorized everything because even in chains, even labeled as property, he remained what he had always been, a soldier, and soldiers never stopped planning, never stopped preparing, never stopped looking for the weakness in enemy defenses that would allow them to strike back when the moment came. And that moment would come because Lady Zephora had made a mistake that she would not understand until it was far too late. She had assumed that capturing a human meant breaking a human, but humans did not break the way other species did, and the Valtharian Empire was about to learn that lesson in the hardest way possible. She laughed, calling him a slave. He broke her champion in seconds. Part 2. The Estate of Blood Lady. Zephora's estate sprawled across 50 acres of carefully maintained grounds, with gardens that held plants from a dozen conquered worlds and fountains that flowed with water infused with minerals that made it shimmer in rainbow colors, and at the center stood her mansion, built in the classical Valtharian style with towers that reached toward the purple sky, but beneath the beauty lay something darker, because deep under the mansion, carved into the bedrock itself, was an arena where Zephora hosted her infamous games, and where slaves fought and died for the entertainment of the nobility, who paid enormous sums for the privilege of watching Krell, the unbroken, destroy opponents with brutal efficiency. Marcus it's processed through the slave intake facility with cold efficiency as guards removed his transport restraints and replaced them with a collar that would deliver painful shocks if he tried to escape or attack anyone, and they scanned his body for weapons or hidden enhancements, finding nothing because Marcus carried no weapons except his mind and body. Holding cells beneath the arena housed perhaps 40 slaves of various species, and they regarded Marcus with a mixture of pity and curiosity, because new arrivals were always interesting in the brief time before they died, and a few of the older slaves knew what his arrival meant. Fresh meat for the game, said Aurelian named Thoros, whose blue scales had dulled from years in captivity, and whose 3 eyes showed the hopelessness that came from watching too many friends die in the sand. Below, Marcus nodded but said nothing, as he was assigned to a cell that he would share with 2 others, and a Korthon pilot named Vex, who had been a prisoner for 4 years, and a young Threxian who had been captured only weeks before and still cried at night for the family he would never see again. The days in the cells followed a rigid schedule, with meals delivered at precise intervals and exercise time in a small yard, where guards watched from elevated positions with weapons ready, and Marcus used every moment to observe and learn and plan, while appearing to be just another broken slave, accepting his fate in the second day. Zephora descended to the arena level with a group of noble guests who wanted a preview of the upcoming entertainment, and she stood behind the reinforced viewing glass, looking down at the sand-stained dark with the blood of countless victims, and she pointed at various slaves, while explaining their fates to her guests. That one will face Krell first, she said, indicating a massive Corvan warrior who stood nearly 7 feet tall with arms like tree Trunks, he should last maybe 30 seconds if he is lucky. Her guests laughed and made bets on the exact time of death because that was part of the entertainment for them. And then Zephora's eyes fell on Marcus, who stood at the bars of his cell looking up at her with an expression she could not quite read. "And that one," she continued, pointing at Marcus with one of her upper hands, "is a human, a species so primitive they still fight with chemical projectile weapons on their homeworld. And he will be the final entertainment after Krell has warmed up with the others." One of her guests leaned closer to the glass, studying Marcus with interest, and asking why she would waste time on such an obviously weak specimen, and Zephora laughed. "That crystal bell sound again because—" "My dear friend," she replied, "variety is important, and watching something die quickly can be just as entertaining as watching something struggle, and besides, I paid almost nothing for him, so there is no real loss." Marcus met her eyes through the glass, and for just a moment she felt something cold pass through her because there was no fear in his gaze, only a calm assessment that reminded her of how Krell looked at opponents before a fight, but she dismissed the thought because what could a human possibly do against her? Champion that evening, after the nobles had departed and the slaves were given their evening meal, Marcus sat in his cell with Thuros and Vex, and for the first time since his capture, he began to speak not in the defeated tones of a broken slave, but in the measured voice of someone explaining a tactical situation. "How many guards on night duty?" he asked quietly, while appearing to focus on his food. Thuros blinked in surprise at the question. Because slaves did not ask such things, slaves accepted their fate, but something in Marcus's tone made him answer, for on this level he said to, at the main entrance to patrolling the cell blocks. "Why does it matter?" Marcus continued eating calmly while his mind processed the information, and he asked more questions about guard rotation. Times about the arena's layout, about where weapons were stored, about the mansion's security systems, and slowly Thuros began to understand that this human was not resigned to death. He were planning something. The Relian said with wonder in his voice, "But it is impossible. There is no escape from this place. Others have tried, and all have died." Trying, Marcus finally looked up at him directly, and Thuros saw something in those human eyes that he had not seen in 4 years. He saw hope, backed by cold calculation. "Am not planning an escape," Marcus said quietly. "I am planning a war over the next day." Marcus continued his subtle intelligence gathering while maintaining the appearance of a defeated slave, and he learned that Zephora's security relied heavily on the assumption that slaves were too broken or too afraid to organize, and that the guards had grown complacent from years of facing no real resistance. He also learned about Krell and the champion's reputation, and his perfect record of victories, and how he had killed hundreds of opponents in the arena over the years, and how even the strongest warriors fell before his cybernetic enhancements and brutal fighting style. On the evening before the scheduled games, Zephora made a personal visit to the cell level, flanked by guards, and she stopped at Marcus's cell, looking at him with a mixture of amusement and contempt. "Maro, you die human," she said, speaking slowly as if to a child. "And I am giving you a choice that I rarely offer. You can die quickly with some dignity if you kneel immediately when you enter the arena, or you can struggle and fight, and die slowly while my guests enjoy every moment of your suffering. Which do you choose?" Marcus stood and approached the bars, meeting her gaze directly, and when he spoke, his voice was calm and measured. "I have a question," he said, and Zephora raised one eyebrow in surprise because slaves rarely spoke to her directly. "What are the rules of combat in your arena?" Marcus asked. "Are there any restrictions on how I can fight, or what techniques I can use?" Zephora laughed, delighted by the question because it showed the human still had some spirit, even if it was foolish spirit. "There are no rules," she said with satisfaction. "You may fight however you wish. Use any tactic you can imagine, and it will make no difference because Krell has faced every fighting style from 100 worlds, and he has defeated them all. Then I accept the challenge," Marcus said, Simplix Aferis. Smile widened because she thought the human was trying to be brave in his final hours, and she found it amusing in a pathetic way, and she left the cell block with her guards trailing behind her already, planning the seating arrangements for tomorrow's entertainment after she was gone. Thuros approached Marcus's cell from the adjacent one and spoke in an urgent whisper. "You cannot win," he said. "Krell is unbeatable. Even our strongest warriors fell in seconds. You are human. You are smaller, weaker. Why would you challenge death like this?" Marcus was doing careful stretches in his cell, moving through forms that the aliens did not recognize as advanced combat training, and when he answered, his voice carried a certainty that made several nearby slaves stop and listen because she made a mistake. Marcus said, continuing his exercises. "She thinks human means weak, but she does not understand what human really means." He paused in his movements and looked at the rows. "Directly humans spent 10,000 years perfecting the art of killing things bigger and stronger than ourselves, and we got very good at it. Hash." She laughed, calling him a slave high, broke her champion in seconds. Hash hash Part 3. The arena awakens. The arena filled quickly on the morning of the games, with Valtharian nobles arriving in expensive transports and wearing their finest garments, because attending Lady Zephora's exhibitions was a mark of social status, and missing such an event meant being excluded from the highest circles of power. The viewing gallery surrounded the circular sand floor in rising tiers that provided perfect sight lines from every angle, and the seats were cushioned with materials harvested from conquered worlds. And servants moved through the crowd, offering refreshments and taking bets on how long each slave would survive. Lady Zephora sat in her royal box, elevated above all the others with the best view of the arena floor, and she wore a gown of shimmering fabric that changed colors as she moved, and her forearms gestured dramatically as she explained the entertainment schedule to the nobles. Seated nearby 3 preliminary matches, she announced with satisfaction, to warm up Krell and teach these slaves the price of defiance, and then the main event. A human who still thinks he can fight. Laughter rippled through the crowd, because everyone had heard of humans by now, and the general consensus among the Valtharian elite was that they were a disappointment as a species, too soft and emotional and physically weak to be useful for anything except the most basic laborian. The preparation cells beneath the arena. Marcus stood alone in a small chamber waiting for his turn, because Zifra had decided to save him for last after Krell had already demonstrated his dominance over the 3 larger, stronger warriors. Who would die first? He could hear the crowd above their excited voices and occasional cheers filtering down through the stone and metal, and he used the time to center himself, to slow his breathing and heart rate, to enter the mental state that his instructors had taught him decades ago during Special Forces training. Combat is 90% mental, his first sergeant had said so many years ago on Earth, before Marcus had ever imagined he would end up captured by aliens on a world whose name he did not even know. And the body can do incredible things when the mind is properly prepared. The arena doors opened, and the first victim was led out onto the sand, and Marcus listened to the sounds of the brief violent combat that followed, and the way the crowd's cheers crescendoed, and then fell silent as Krell made his kill. And then the second warrior was sent out with similar results. The third warrior was the Corvin, who Zephora had pointed out days before, and Marcus heard him roar in defiance as he charged Krell, and the sound of impact as the champion caught him and broke him, and the crowd's delighted response to the brutality. Then silence fell, and Marcus heard his name called in the common trading language, and the door to his cell opened, and 2 guards gestured with their weapons for him to walk toward the arena entrance. He moved calmly without resistance, and as he approached the gate that led to the sand, he could hear Zephara's voice amplified by speakers, explaining to the crowd what they were about to witness. "And now, my friends," she said with theatrical flair, "we have something special. A human male captured from one of their pathetic colony ships, and foolish enough to believe he can challenge Krell the Unbroken." The crowd erupted in laughter and mocking calls, and Marcus stepped through the gate onto the sand that was still wet with the blood of the 3 warriors who had died minutes before. The arena was exactly as he had memorized it from descriptions. A perfect circle 100 feet in diameter, with walls 15 feet high, topped by the energy barriers that prevented escape, and the sand was deep enough to slow movement slightly, which favored the heavier fighter in most cases. But Marcus was not most fighters across the arena. Another gate opened, and Krell emerged to thunderous applause, and he raised his arms acknowledging the crowd's adoration because he was their champion, their entertainment, their symbol of Valtharian superiority over all other species. Krell stood 9 feet tall, and his cybernetic enhancements gleamed in the artificial lighting that illuminated the arena floor, and his arms ended in hands that had crushed skulls and torn limbs from bodies, and his face showed no emotion, because to him, this was just another execution, just another day of work. The crowd quieted as Zephora stood in her box and made the formal announcement begin. She called out, and her voice echoed through the space, and Krell began walking toward Marcus with the confident stride of someone who had never known defeat. Marcus did not charge or retreat. He simply stood his ground and watched Krell approach, and his posture was relaxed, almost casual, as if he were waiting for a friend rather than facing a killer. Krell closed the distance and launched his first attack. Straight punch with his right hand that had enough force to shatter concrete, and it should have been the end of the fight. A single strike to kill the small human and entertain the crowd, but Marcus was not there. He moved at the last possible moment, shifting his weight and angling his body so that Krell's fists passed inches from his head. And the champion's momentum carried him forward off balance for just a fraction of a second. Crowd gasped because they had expected immediate death, not evasion. Krell recovered quickly and attacked again, this time with a combination of strikes using both hands in a pattern that had killed dozens of opponents. But Marcus flowed around the attacks like water, his movements economical and precise, wasting no energy on unnecessary motion. He was reading Krell the way he had been trained to read opponents, recognizing patterns in the way the champion telegraphed his strikes and learning the rhythm of his attacks and the slight delay caused by the interface between organic nerves and cybernetic systems. Krell's strikes came faster now, tinged with the first hint of frustration, because the human should be dead already, should be broken and bleeding on the sand. But instead, he kept moving, kept evading. And the champion's attacks hit only ere Marcus began to speak. Then his voice calm and conversational, as if he were teaching a class rather than fighting for his life. Humans have been killing each other for 10,000 years, he said while ducking under a strike that would have decapitated him, and we got very good at it because we had to. He sidestepped another attack and continued. We are not the strongest species in our galaxy, he said, and we are not the fastest, and we do not have natural armor or claws or cybernetic enhancement. Krell roared in anger and launched a flurry of strikes that should have been impossible to evade in such a small space, but Marcus moved through them, finding the gaps in the champion's offense that came from overconfidence and predictable patterns. But what we have, Marcus said, as he slipped past another strike, is 10 millennia of accumulated knowledge about how to kill things bigger than us. The crowd had stopped laughing now, and they watched in confused silence as their champion failed again and again to land a single blow on the small human who moved like smoke through Krell's attacks. Lady Zephora stood in her box, gripping the rail with all 4 hands, and her expression had shifted from amusement to confusion to something approaching concern, because this was not how her games were supposed to proceed. Marcus continued speaking as he moved, and his voice carried through the silent arena. We studied anatomy and physics and leverage, he said, and we learned that size does not matter as much as technique, that strength means nothing without proper application. Movements were becoming wild now, less controlled, as frustration turned to rage, and Marcus recognized the shift and knew that his moment was approaching, because angry fighters made mistakes. We learned how to break joints and disrupt nerve clusters, Marcus said, still evading, and we learned that every body has structural weaknesses that can be exploited by someone who knows what they are doing. He dodged another strike. And then, for the first time since the fight began, Marcus moved forward instead of away, and he closed the distance between himself and Krell in a single fluid motion that took the champion completely by surprise. And most importantly, Marcus said, as his hands moved with surgical precision, finding the exact points he needed. We learned that the biggest mistake you can make is underestimating an opponent based on their appearances. Fingers found the nerve cluster in Krell's left arm, the point where organic tissue interfaced with cybernetic systems, and he applied pressure in exactly the right way, with exactly the right way. Amount of force. Krell's arm went numb and dropped too. His side and the champion's eyes widened in shock, because in all his years of fighting, Nothing like this had ever happened. Arena remained silent as Marcus stepped back, creating distance again, and his breathing was still controlled, still calm. As if the fight had just begun rather than being well underway, and Krell, for the first time in his long career as champion, understood that he was not fighting a slave, he was fighting a predator. She laughed, calling him a slave. He broke her champion. In seconds, Part 4, the champion falls. Silence in the arena was absolute as thousands of Valtharian nobles stared at the impossible scene below, because Krell the Unbroken stood with his left arm hanging useless at his side while the small humans circled him with the casual confidence of someone who had already won. Krell roared and charged forward, using his right arm and his legs to compensate for the disabled limb, and his cybernetic enhancements still gave him tremendous power and speed, but Marcus had already mapped every weakness in his opponent's system, and now he simply had to execute the plan. The champion's charge was impressive and terrifying, and would have crushed most opponents, but Marcus waited until the last moment, and then dropped low, sweeping his leg in a move that targeted not Krell's knees, but the cybernetic joint connecting his right leg to his hip. The impact was precise and devastating because Marcus understood that cybernetic joints were actually weaker than organic ones if you knew exactly where to strike them, and Krell stumbled forward, his balance disrupted by the sudden failure of his mechanical components. Marcus rolled away and came to his feet in one smooth motion, and he continued, speaking in that same calm, instructional tone that had begun to unnerve even the most confident nobles in the viewing gallery's human military. History is filled with examples of smaller forces defeating larger ones, he said, as Krell struggled to regain his footing. We call it asymmetric warfare, and we have been practicing it since before we had written language. Krell turned to face him, and the champion's face showed something that his victims had never seen before. Doubt mixed with the first traces of actual fear. We learned that you do not fight strength with strength, Marcus continued, circling to Krell's disabled side. You fight strength with precision and knowledge and patience. The champion lunged again, but his movements were compromised now by the damaged arm and the malfunctioning leg joint, and Marcus simply stepped aside, and as Krell passed him, he struck again, this time targeting the elbow joint of the champion's remaining functional arm. The strike was not flashy or dramatic, it was simply a precisely applied force to a specific point, and the result was immediate. As Krell's right arm bent at an angle that made several nobles in the front rows turn away because even they could recognize the wrongness of the position. Both of Krell's arms now hung useless, and the champion stood in the center of the arena, breathing heavily, and for the first time in his career understanding what all his victims had felt in their final moments, the helplessness of facing something they could not defeat. Lady Zephora stood in her box with all four of her hands gripping the rail so tightly that the metal bent under the pressure, and her face had gone pale beneath her violet skin because this could not be happening. Her champion could not be losing to a human. Kill him, she screamed at Krell, her voice breaking with desperation. Use your legs. Crush him, do something. But Krell was learning what Marcus had known from the beginning, that weapons and enhancements meant nothing against an opponent who understood anatomy and physics and leverage better than you did. Marcus moved in again, and this time there was no lecture, no explanation. He simply went to work with the cold efficiency of someone who had been trained to disable opponents quickly and completely. He struck Krell's right knee with a kick that targeted the lateral joint, and the combination of organic bone and cybernetic enhancement actually made the joint weaker than either would have been alone. And something inside the champion's leg snapped with a sound that echoed through the silent arena. Krell dropped to one knee and tried to rise, but Marcus was already moving to the other side, and another precisely placed strike destroyed the left knee joint, and the champion fell forward, catching himself with his face because his arms no longer worked. The crowd remained frozen in shock because they had come to see a human die quickly, and instead, they were watching their undefeated champion being systematically dismantled by that same human who moved with a precision that suggested he could have ended the fight at any moment, but was choosing to draw it out. Marcus circled the fallen champion, and when he spoke again, his voice carried to every corner of the arena. Your people made a mistake, he said, looking up at the viewing galleries at Lady Zephora, at all the nobles who had laughed when he was purchased at the market. You saw humans and you saw weakness because we are smaller. Then most warrior species, Krell, tried to rise again using pure determination, but his body no longer responded to his commands, and he could only watch as the human walked around him. But do not ask why a species as physically weak as humans managed to become the dominant predator on a planet filled with animals faster and stronger than us. Marcus continued, "You did not ask how we survived long enough to reach the stars." He stopped in front of Krell and looked down at the champion with eyes that held no mercy and no hatred, only cold, tactical assessment. "The answer is that we are very good at killing things," Marcus said. "We have been practicing for thousands of generations, and we learned to use our intelligence to overcome every physical disadvantage with one final movement." Marcus struck a nerve cluster at the base of Krell's skull with precisely calibrated force, and the champion's eyes rolled back and he collapsed. Face first into the blood-stained sand, unconscious but alive because Marcus had chosen to leave him alive. The silence that followed was deeper than before because everyone in the arena understood that they had just witnessed something that should not have been possible according to everything they knew about humans and about strength and about power. Marcus stood over the fallen champion and turned to face Lady Zifra's box, and when he spoke, his voice was no longer the calm, instructional tone of a teacher, but the hard command voice of a soldier. "Was a soldier before you captured me," he said, "and every human in your empire was something before you took them, and you thought that making us slaves would make us helpless." He gestured at Krell's unconscious form, "But you cannot make a soldier helpless by putting him in chains. You can only make him angry, lady." Zifra's face had gone from pale to flushed with rage and humiliation because her entire social circle had just watched her champion fall to a human slave, and she screamed at her guards, kill him now, I want him dead immediately." Arena doors burst open, and a dozen guards rushed onto the sand with weapons raised, and Marcus evaluated the situation in a fraction of a second and recognized that he could not defeat 12 armed guards, but he had already accomplished something more important than his own survival. He had shown every slave in the estate and every human watching through whatever monitoring systems existed that humans were not helpless, and that their captors were not invincible, and that resistance was possible. The guards surrounded him with weapons pointed at his head and chest, and Marcus raised his hands slowly in surrender, because dying now would waste the opportunity he had created. But before the guards could secure him, a commotion erupted from the cell levels beneath the arena, and alarms began to sound throughout the estate, because while the nobles had been watching the games, the other slaves had been watching too, and they had seen what Marcus had shown them, that their captors could bleed, and that chains only held you if you accepted them. Guards hesitated, looking at each other in confusion as more alarms sounded, and reports came through their communication devices of slave riots breaking out across the estate. Marcus smiled then for the first time since his capture, and it was not a pleasant smile. "Lady Zifra," he called up to her box, "while I had your attention down here, my friends had time to work because Marcus had not spent his days in captivity planning just his own fight in the arena. He had been planning a war, and wars were what humans did best." She laughed, calling him a slave. He broke her champion. In seconds, Part 5. The Empire's mistake. Chaos erupted throughout Lady Zifra's estate as alarms screamed and nobles scrambled for the exits, while guards rushed toward the cell levels, where 40 slaves had somehow managed to overwhelm their captors and were now loose in the facility with weapons they should not have had access to in the arena. Marcus stood surrounded by guards, who were receiving conflicting orders through their communication devices, because half were being told to secure the human, while the other half were being redirected to contain the slave uprising, and in their confusion, they made the fatal mistake of hesitating. Marcus moved with the same precise efficiency he had shown against Krell, and he struck the nearest guard at the wrist, causing him to drop his weapon, and before the others could react, Marcus had the weapon in his hands and was rolling behind the fallen body of Krell, using the unconscious champion as cover. The guards opened fire, but their shots hit their own champion instead of the human, and Marcus returned fire with controlled bursts that targeted weapon hands and leg joints. Because he needed chaos, not corpses, and wounded guards screaming in pain created more confusion than dead Once from above, Lady Zephora watched her ordered world collapse into madness, and she screamed orders that no one followed because her guards were too busy trying to contain multiple crises at once, and her noble guests were fleeing through every available exit caring only about their own safety. Marcus sprinted across the arena sand and reached the gate that led to the preparation cells, and he shot the lock mechanism and kicked the door open, revealing a corridor filled with smoke and the sounds of fighting because Thuros and Vex had done exactly what Marcus had instructed them to do. The Relian engineer had spent 3 days in captivity, carefully studying the estates, security systems, and waiting for the right moment. And when the games began, and all attention focused on the arena, he had used skills learned over decades to disable the cell locks and weapon storage security protocols. Vex, the Korthon pilot, had spent 4 years memorizing guard patterns and shift changes and emergency response procedures, and he had shared all that knowledge with the other slaves who were ready to act when Marcus gave them the signal by defeating Krayland. That signal had been clear, because if a human could bring down the undefeated champion, then anything was possible. Marcus ran through the corridor past cells that stood open and empty, and he found Thuros and Vex leading a group of freed slaves toward the armory, and when they saw him, they grinned with fierce joy, because the plan was working better than any of them had dared hope. The armory was already breached, and slaves were taking weapons and equipment, while Thuros worked at a computer terminal accessing the estate's systems with passwords he had stolen months ago by watching guards type them. Marcus joined him at the terminal, and his fingers moved across the interface with purpose, because he had one specific goal in mind, and everything else was just preparation for this moment. "What are you doing?" Thuros asked while providing covering fire as guards attempted to retake the armory. "Sending a message," Marcus replied, and his voice carried absolute certainty. The terminal showed a communications array, powerful enough to reach across star systems, because Lady Zephora used it to coordinate her business interests and social connections across multiple worlds, and Marcus entered a specific frequency that every human fleet officer had memorized during basic training. It was an emergency code that had not been used in the decades since humanity first ventured beyond their solar system, because it was reserved for only one situation: when human populations were under systematic threat and needed immediate military response. Marcus sent the code, along with coordinates and a brief message in human military encryption, and then he triggered a broadcast that would repeat the signal every 30 seconds. "Until someone destroyed the Araden," he said, standing from the terminal. "Now, we move them." Freed slaves had organized themselves with surprising efficiency, because desperation and hope were powerful motivators, and they fought their way through the estate toward the private landing pads, where Lady Zephora kept her personal ship's guards. Tried to stop them, but they were trained to deal with individual slaves attempting escape, not coordinated group actions, led by someone with military training, and Marcus used every tactic he had learned over 2 decades of service to outmaneuver and outthink the opposition. They reached the landing pads, where 6 ships sat ready for use, and Marcus directed the freed slaves to board while Vex moved toward the pilot positions, because flying was what Korthons did best, and 4 years of captivity had not made him forget. But before they could launch, Lady Zephora herself appeared, flanked by her personal guard unit, and she held a weapon in her upper right hand, and her face was twisted with rage and humiliation. "You've destroyed everything," she screamed at Marcus. "Do you understand what you have done? I will be ruined, my reputation, my status, all because of one pathetic human." Marcus faced her calmly with his own weapon held ready, and when he spoke, his voice carried across the landing. "Padno," he said, "I have freed 40 people from captivity, and that is enough. But what happens next is not my doing, it is your Sephiroth's." Finger tightened on the trigger, but before she could fire, the sky above the estate lit up with the distinctive signatures of ships dropping out of hyperspace, and emergency broadcasts began flooding all communication channels. Multiple human fleet signatures detected in system. All ships are advised to stand down and prepare for inspection. This sector is now under human military authority by order of the United Earth Defense Force. Lady Zephora's weapon dropped from her hand as she stared at the sky, where dozens of ships were now visible, their human markings clear even from the ground, and Marcus saw understanding dawn on her face. "What did you do?" she whispered, and her voice had lost all its arrogance, all its cruelty. I sent a code, Marcus explained, that told every human fleet within 10 light years that this system was engaged in systematic human slavery, and that code has only one authorized response: 3. More ships appeared overhead, and these were different from the others because they were not exploration vessels or colony transports. They were warships built by humans for the express purpose of protecting other humans. Overwhelming military response. Marcus continued, watching Zyphra's face as she realized the magnitude of her mistake. Your empire has been capturing humans for 30 years, and every single one of those humans is now a priority rescue target. The lead human warship sent a communication that played across every device on the estate, and a crisp military voice delivered a message in perfect common trading language. This is Captain Sarah Chen of the UEDF. Retribution to all human captives in this system. Help is here, and to all species holding humans in captivity. You have 1 hour to surrender them peacefully before we begin extraction by force. Lady Zephora fell to her knees, and her forearms hung limp at her sides because she understood what was coming, and the Valtherian Empire had made decisions based on human weakness. But those decisions were about to cost them everything. Marcus walked past her, toward the ships where Thoros and Vex were helping the last of the freed slaves board, and he paused only briefly to look back at the noblewoman who had laughed at him in the market. You called me a slave, Marcus said, but you did not understand what that word means to humans because we have a history with slavery. And we remember what our ancestors did to escape it, and we remember the price they paid. He gestured at the sky where more human ships were arriving by the minitand. We decided a long time ago that we would never let it happen again. Not to us, not to anyone. And when you took that first human ship 30 years ago, you activated a response protocol that has been waiting for exactly this situation. Sephora looked up at him with eyes that showed true fear for the first time in her life. What happens now? She asked, and her voice was small and broken now. Marcus said, you learn what humans do when you threaten our species because we are not the strongest or the fastest or the most advanced, but we are the most stubborn, and we never forget and we never forgive when it comes to protecting our own. He turned and walked toward the ships, leaving her kneeling on the landing pad. Ships lifted off with Vex at the controls, and they joined the growing fleet above the planet, and Marcus looked back one last time at the estate below, where nobles fled in panic and guards surrendered their weapons, and everything that we said, Lady Zephora had built crumbled to dustros, sat beside him staring at the fleet with wonder in his eyes. How many humans are there? He asked, because I've never seen so many ships respond so quickly. Billions, Marcus replied, on dozens of worlds, and every single one of them remembers the lesson our ancestors taught us, that freedom is worth fighting for, and that those who take freedom from others will face the full wrath of humanity. The communications channels filled with reports as human forces located and freed slaves from facilities across the sector, and Marcus listened to the voices of people he had never met who had received his signal and responded without question or hesitation, because that was what humans did. Protected their own, and when someone made the mistake of treating them as property instead of people, they reminded the galaxy why humanity had survived 10,000 years of trying to kill itself and emerged as a species that would never kneel to anyone. Lady Zephora had laughed at Marcus, calling him a slave, but she had failed to understand that humans were the one species in the galaxy that had looked at the institution of slavery and decided it was so evil that they fought wars against themselves to end. Now the Valtherian Empire was learning what happened when you inflicted that evil on the descendants of those warriors. Fleet formed up around the rescued ships, and Captain Chen's voice came through the communications channel. Welcome home, everyone, she said. And Marcus Chen, report to my ship when we reach orbit, because the UEDF wants to know everything about Valtherian operations in this sector. Marcus smiled because his mission was not over. It was just beginning, because Zephora had purchased him thinking she was buying entertainment for her games, but what she had actually purchased was the instrument of her empire's downfall and humanity's long memory.